Hi, good morning, everyone, and thank you very much for joining us today here in person in Brussels and online. So today we're going to be talking once more about market design. This is, I think, our fifth event this year and the third report that we're releasing on this issue in 2022. It'll also be the last one, again, for this year, more to come in 2023. So I'll keep it short. I'll just move straight to the agenda. So we will first present the recommendations of our report. So the SARA academic team is here right on my left, and we'll present the final recommendations on market design. We won't talk much about the details of the report, but I do invite you to go check it. It's over 200 pages, so it might take a little while to digest it, but it's worth having a look. There's a lot in there. And then we'll move to a panel discussion. So we've got a great panel, some online, some here with us in person, representing policymaker, regulators, and the industry. So I'll introduce them a bit later, and then we'll have 15 minutes for a Q&A and a lunch for those who are here with us in person today. So moving on to the presentation, I'll get us started very quickly again with a quick reminder of what the work that we've done before in market design. If you can, go to this next slide. So, I mean, Sarah's done work on market design for a while now. Before this year, we produced our last report, in-depth report on this in 2018. This year, we produced two pieces, one on retail, another on wholesale. These were interim reports. And today's report is a lot longer, includes recommendations and as well as major additions on issues such as null pricing, capacity markets, hybrid markets, and additional national case studies. And obviously, over 70 recommendations from the team for future-proofing Europe's electricity market design. Next, please. So just quickly over the authors of the report. So thanks to them, and many thanks also to the SARA members and the many stakeholders that we interacted with throughout the process of this report. It's been great. Thanks a lot for your support and for your inputs. And moving on to this report, I've already talked about it, but you can see on the next slide the structure of it. So again, it's divided between wholesale and retail. And we conveniently place the policy recommendations up front of the report, so you can easily have a look at them. So I'll stop here and I'll let the academic team present the recommendations, starting with my colleague Niels Henrik, who'll speak first to our core recommendations before we dive into specifics on wholesale and retail. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Albrecht. This has been a very interesting project from many perspectives. In particular, I don't think I've worked on a project before where events have been unfolding so rapidly while we're working. There have been a constant stream of new ideas, new proposals, new analyses that we obviously have had to take into account. But we think that perhaps one of our most important recommendations is that we need to distinguish very clearly between short-term crisis management and long-term market reform. The report is about long-term market reform, essentially, but we are still spending quite a lot of time on discussing short-term issues because they're important, and because some of the proposals that have been put forward could potentially undermine the long-term performance of the market. This is not, the current crisis is not a market design crisis. In fact, one could argue that the market has worked remarkably well, been very resilient. We haven't had any supply interruptions. We haven't had blackouts. So the market has to a large extent delivered exactly what we have expected. We might not like the outcome, in particular the very high prices, but that's what a market delivers in times of or shortages. Secondly, the fundamental problem at the moment is a lack of supply, in particular of gas. And it's very important that the measures that are introduced in order to handle the crisis do not make that problem more serious. In fact, the main aim of the crisis management should be to either make available alternative gas supplies or to reduce demand for gas. And hence, we are very critical of the various measures that have been introduced in a number of countries. And here we highlight the price cap on gas in Spain and Portugal as being counterproductive, because they're in fact making the problem worse, not reducing the demand for gas, but increasing it. More generally, we think it's important that from an EU perspective, that the measures that are taken have the aim of preserving the internal market and the good parts of that market for all states and participants. Next, please. For the longer term, the market integration, preserving the current single market and improving it, will become increasingly important. One of the issues that is currently debated quite a lot, we've had very useful input from our sponsors, and it's been discussed in many different arenas, is the importance, the role of long-term contracts. We think it's very important that the extent to which long-term contracts are introduced, and long-term contracts is not any particular, they could be very different, designed differently, backed by governments or by others, priced differently, and so on and so forth. But when they're introduced, they should not be introduced in a way that undermines the functioning of the short-term power markets. That means, in particular, that we should distinguish very clearly between financial hedging, which is what we're mostly concerned about because we want to handle risk, and physical hedging, which is a very different concern. We point out that this is not a good time to enter into long-term contracts. Prices are at peak levels, will come down, and we should not encourage agents to enter into long-term contracts at the currently. Now, long-term contracts might play, and now we're talking about government-backed long-term contracts, may play a very important role in ensuring new investments. Again, one needs to think carefully about how that is done, but with the main aim being to lower the risk and encourage investments. Next, please. Then looking forward towards a net zero society, this is a very good opportunity with the high prices that we see now, the lack of supply, especially of gas, to encourage, to accelerate the move towards net zero. There are a number of obstacles to that, mostly of a political nature, but they can be dealt with. And as I said, this is a good time, perhaps also to have understanding for why it's necessary to move forward. In particular, to accelerate investment, not only in new generation capacity, but also in the networks and the infrastructure that's required. Also to encourage new agents who will be able to facilitate, and in particular on the demand side, participation of consumers to increase flexibility. So there are a number of things that can be done, which we've tried to outline in our reports. In particular, we point out that we're moving towards a world in which many of our sectors using energy, in particular electric power, heating and transport, will be further integrated. And hence the ideas that have been floated about distinguishing or trying to separate prices in different energy markets or energy areas is very counterproductive and should be avoided. On the contrary, we are moving towards a world in which these areas, these sectors will be coupled to an even larger extent than they are today. Thank you.
Thanks, Nils Henrik. So to move on to some of the recommendations that are specifically about the wholesale market. Our starting point for discussing the wholesale electricity market is that, it's important to distinguish between pure market design elements and things that we can do around the market. So a pure market design element might be something like whether auctions are pay as bid or pay as clear. And that's, if you like, a pure element of market design, whereas complementary mechanisms might be something like the extent to which we engage in long-term contracting. And it's important to also keep in perspective that, what keeps prices down is proper monitoring of demand, available supply, and addressing anti-competitive behavior, and making sure that we've got flexible demand, keep demand down, making sure that supply is cheap and up, and monitoring anti-competitive behavior. Those are more important to the functioning of the market than particular market design elements. Of course, we could imagine a move to a very different market design in Europe, away from the design that we do have, based on zonal prices and self-dispatch, towards a US style market based on capacity markets and nodal prices. Yes, we could do that, but that is not the solution to this current crisis. And the debates around US versus European styles of market design are the same now as they were before. And as we write extensively in the report, things like nodal pricing are clearly not the solution to the current crisis. But that's not to say that better locational signals, particularly with respect to long-term investment, are not required. Next slide, please. One of the intellectually more interesting suggestions that's come forward in the current crisis is that perhaps we should have two short-run markets, one for on-demand power, such as fossil fuel generation, and one for as available intermittent renewable power. And that somehow we can exploit the fact that at the moment the price might be lower for the as available power as for the on-demand power. But of course, that doesn't make any real intellectual sense. Electricity is the same no matter how it's produced. In this current crisis, it is very important that we maintain incentives to maximize electricity output at any given price. And that is undermined by having two short-run markets, as we discuss very clearly in the report. And as Niels Hendrik has already said, if this suggestion doesn't make much sense today, it makes even less sense in the future when we're going to have this much tighter integration of heat transport and power markets, and making sure that you've got efficiency of market operation in the short run is really important. The two short-run market suggestion is different from the hybrid market solution, which we also discuss in the report, which says, well, we could have some long-term contracts for low carbon generation, which lock in lower prices for that type of generation, because we can run an auction, say for offshore wind production or for nuclear, and get a low price for that. And that low price can be baked into the tariff model that determines consumer prices, and consumers can benefit from low prices for that type of generation. That sort of arrangement does make a lot of sense. And that leads us on to a long discussion in the report about different types of long-term contracts. And we distinguish between corporate, retailer, and government power purchase arrangements, which involve longer-term contracting, often for 15 years or more. And I'll hand on.
Yeah, so it's essential to address economic justice because we are in a state of war in energy markets. So it's actually sensible to recoup some excess generation profits at least in the short run. And in the report, we say that this is best done in a mechanism that's not blunt incentives for efficient dispatch and operational efficiency. So that means that we have to target infra-marginal rents because we don't want to change marginal incentives. And this can also be done by excess profit tax. And we think that an excess profit tax is better than having some arbitrary price cap on some selection of technologies or certain types of generators. And the revenue that's being collected by those excess profit taxes, those need to be recycled for compensating consumer bills or through direct income support. And this both for equity reasons and also to mitigate inflationary effects. So we also stress that this excess profit taxes, they should be limited in time. So they should not be imposed beyond the current crisis. And that's because in the long run, all decisions are marginal. So all decisions, investments, operational decisions, they will depend on prices. And we might have negative effects on long-run efficiencies, long-run incentives, and also innovation incentives, and especially for new entrants, they might not enter the market. So in the long run, we still expect that there will be positional rents for renewables. So there might be certain wind farms that are at better locations with higher wind speeds. And we think those rents can be extracted via site auctions. So we can have an auction for access to the seabed, auctions for long-term PPAs. So you're obliged to participate in certain long-term PPAs where the price then extracts some of the rents, or this could also be done by profit taxes. So next slide. Okay. So PPAs, they play an important role for the risk management, especially for renewable energy. And they lower the cost of capital for investors, and they also provide some long-term certainty for the consumers. So as we have, Mike already said before, we have seen that there are corporate PPAs, and that makes sense for companies that are long-lived and they have often like a large demand for energy. This also makes sense for retailers if they have a stable consumer base. And we think that for retailers, this is going to become more important in the future because there might be additional risk regulation for retailers, because we have seen that they're taking too much risk in the past. So if they have to reduce their risk, they're going to be more active in this PPA markets. And if we introduce secondary markets for the PPAs, they can also trade away some of the risk to other retailers if their market share might change. And we think that those corporate and retail PPAs, they will stay important in the future because there's a lot of innovation in contract terms that we see developing between those parties. So auction-based competitive PPAs, they might be useful in bringing forth new investments, and we get the competitive pressure, and this might then lower the cost of new investments and might lower the cost of low carbon generations. And as the organization of those auctions for long-term PPAs, they might bring about a hybrid market formation where we have competition in the long run for those PPAs, and in the short run, we still have those power markets. We also think that signing retrospective PPAs for existing generators, that this is not really going to lower the total bill, energy bill. So it's going to shift the cost of the energy across time. And basically, this is a way of basically smoothing payments for consumers based on private sector discount rates. And this should be left to national preferences. So next slide. So government PPAs, so that means that it's the government who is going to back some of those PPAs. So they might be successful in driving down the cost of capital, especially for new emerging technologies. And there are cases where retailers and corporate PPA market is not competitive or maybe not in sufficiently large quantities. And well-designed government PPAs, they might actually improve on the existing support schemes for renewable energy, especially if they also provide incentives for those technology to participate in the short-term market. So for instance, the feed-in tariff doesn't always give the right incentives for let's say a wind farm to try to offer also like some balancing service or some reserve power that they could do maybe. So one example of such a PPA system is in the UK, where it's the government through this low carbon contracts company who is going to buy some of those contracts. That's the counterparty to those contracts. And when we use this system, we should make sure that if prices on the electricity market are higher than the PPA prices, that some of those revenues then are returned to consumers so that they also benefit from the hedge that's being signed by the government. Okay, then I'll hand it over.
Thank you, Bert. And what is the role of the EU when it comes to PPAs? We stress in the report that we have different types of PPAs, as has just been presented. And during the past decade, we have seen that notably corporate renewable PPAs have become increasingly popular in attracting financing for renewable energy projects. And for this, the EU has been intervening by facilitating their use in notably by a revision of the Renewable Energy Directive. And under the Fit for 55 package, it is also proposed to reinforce these provisions. So it has been a way of facilitating the choice in favor of corporate PPAs. However, we stress that the choice of the instrument should be left to the member states, in particular when it comes to government-backed PPAs that could be could involve state resources, and therefore they could challenge stated rules, and this could therefore be an issue to further scrutiny. As part of that, the European Commission could facilitate further their use by providing guidelines or by amending the stated guidelines and address some of the remaining hurdles for the states to use them. But again, this should be left to the choice of the member state to decide in favor of notably government PPAs, and this is left to the discretion of the member states in accordance with the subsidiarity principle. As part of our recommendations, we also look at the broader picture of the internal energy market. And here our advice is first to focus on the completion and the extension of the internal energy market in gas and electricity. We have adopted recently a new package that is still under implementation, and the focus should be on the full and complete implementation of this package before turning to the adoption of new harmonized measures. Then, if we look at additional measures that could be subject to EU harmonization, we advise to speed up notably the provision and use of two-way transfer capacity in gas and electricity, but as well to pursue the further completion of the internal energy market by providing enough cross-border interconnector capacity, by managing transparency on the energy markets and notably electricity market at the moment, and therefore to ensure that we have a strong internal market without trade barriers between the member states, but as well with our neighboring countries, because the electricity market regulation is also adopted by other countries around us through different types of international agreements. We have the EEA agreement, so the agreement of the European Economic Area that also incorporates all internal energy market legislation. We have as well the bilateral agreement with the UK, but we have as well agreements with Switzerland and energy community countries. So therefore, when we are contemplating revision of electricity market legislation, it also affects our neighboring countries and possibility to cooperate with friendly neighboring countries and partners, and so to optimize security of supply and trade and complementarity when so is needed. So therefore, a careful assessment of any revision of electricity market regulation, also in the context of external dimension. And finally, we stress the need to pay special attention to the standardization of capacity mechanisms across Europe, but as well the possibility of accessing to these mechanisms through notably the inclusion of interconnectors as it is today, but to keep the trend in doing so.
Let me now finish our overview by discussing few points on the retail market. So obviously one of the big issue is the demand response. So as a principle, wholesale price must be reflected in retail price at the margin. And that's really the principle. Then, of course, from different study or experiment, we know that organizing campaign to reduce demand and have associated tariff setting that encourage a large reduction in consumption works. So we should have this all over Europe. The third point is really about prosumer and the role of prosumer in demand response. It was highlighted in the Fit for 55 package. There is a role for the prosumer, and it will be also beneficially. It will be beneficial for the market, and also it will allow some. We could imagine having some fiscal effect. The fourth point is also that smart meters need to be used more effectively in any energy crisis. And you can imagine smart contract offered by retailer with the encouragement of regulator and government. Next slide. The trade-off and the challenge, I will say, is really to find the right trade-off between demand response and equitable energy bills. So the first point that we want to mention is that to define equitable bill, we need energy data. So there is a need to integrate or to make sure we have energy data in the system, and therefore, this will allow us to deliver effective and timely financial support to consumer. Now, demand reduction, this trade-off between demand reduction and equity concern is also can be reflected in the tariff. So tariffs should allow customers to hedge market risk, while still encouraging demand flexibility and energy conservation. And you can imagine different type of tariff, but one is to establish a block tariff. Another one is to favor long-term contract with fixed price for more vulnerable consumer. Next slide. Finally, there is a need for a regulation of retail offers. We need stricter requirements on the financial position of the supplier, but also consumer must, to some extent, be held responsible for the choice of supplier and the way they entering a new contract on reasonable terms. And that's really important. Finally, you know, there is some, of course, financial regulation and customer protection comes at a cost, and we need to address this trade-off and make sure we give the priority, or that the national energy regulator decide on this issue. Next slide. My last slide is about the effect of and the need of monitoring the retail effect on the single market. We know that market interventions which increase European wholesale market demand or have large detrimental cross-border effect should be prevented. This is really important also when we think about competitivity and across Europe, and we observe that we want to have we observe that member states have different commercial and industrial prices, and also we want to make sure that we have in mind, and we have in mind that state aid should be a concern, and we should really not forget this last point. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, guys, for a very thorough presentation of the recommendations. I'm going to jump straight into the panel discussion. So I'm going to go over the list very quickly. So we've got Clara from ARERA and Acer, Christophe from DG Ener, Elena from Greece's PPC, Simone from Enel, Fabio from Terna, Inga Kristin from Norsk Hydro, so from industrial consumer perspective more, and also an energy player. And Alain from EDF, as well as, sorry, you're missing from this list, Bill, but you're here online with us also. So Bill Emery, who's the chair of the Northern Irish Utility Regulator. So it's a great panel. We've got representatives from industry, regulators, and the policy-making side. I'll be moderating this panel. For the audience, if you've got questions, just drop them in the chat. I'll have a regular look at it, and I'll make sure that I try to pick as many questions as possible. And if you're in the room, just maybe raise your hand, and I'll also try and keep an eye on the room. So we've divided the presentation between wholesale and retail. So I'll try and sort of keep this format for the discussion, also first focusing on wholesale questions and then on retail, but obviously the two are very much connected. And I think we also need to look at things from a both short-term and long-term perspective, as also emphasized by the academic team just now. So maybe I'll just, to get us started, focus on this short versus long-term aspect and ask a double question first to Clara and then to Christophe on what concrete actions, what should be prioritized over the short term to facing the crisis versus longer term issues on the way to net zero, and maybe given taking this into account and what the SARE academic team just presented, is what is decoupling a sound short or long-term policy goal? So the definition of decoupling is a bit unclear, but we hear a lot about that. The buzzword was a couple of years ago sector coupling, and now it's decoupling. So it's quite interesting to see how things have changed quite fast. But yeah, so starting with Clara, maybe, and then I'll give it to Christophe.
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me. Yeah, I think it's not very clear what decoupling means. So the question, we have to interpret the question. Let's assume that we are discussing about the pricing mechanism in a short-term market. Many stakeholders and policymakers blamed the marginal pricing principle and the functioning of our short-term markets in general for the high energy cost. And as you know, they emphasize that the cost of electricity produced from gas, that represents only a small share of the electricity production, should not determine electricity prices for all produced electricity, as most of it is produced with a much lower at a much lower cost. And therefore, different ideas have been put on the table and proposed, and this is why I'm saying that decoupling is not clear what is meant. And one of those ideas was to say that electricity price paid by consumers should represent the average of electricity production cost. I think not even the definition of cost is clear here, but anyway, for example, by paying each producer according to its own bid and not the bid of the marginal unit. So if we interpret this as the decoupling of the market as moving to a pay-as-bid solution, I fully agree with what the report says, that this would not solve the problem of inframarginal rents. There is a large literature there. Market participants would adjust their bidding behavior. So probably this is just a misunderstanding, because everybody agrees that moving to pay-as-bid would not be useful. But I think we have to recognize that in general, the reform of our marginal pricing method and of our short-term markets is not one of the most needed at the moment. So we can improve our short-term markets, but the problem is not there. Is more on a long-term perspective. And in general, discussion about inframarginal rents and remuneration of generators is not well placed if we discuss it only under the short-term market design. On the nodal, if I stick to the term short-term market design, I agree that moving to an American style, US style market design would probably now not be possible, maybe too difficult, but at the same time, I think we needed to discuss what is the role of the physical constraints in our market. And I think they have a role, and we have pretending for a long time that they didn't. So we really need to improve our locational system, signal, but we have to clearly discuss redispatching and counter trading is still an issue. What is the definition of our market zones? Market zone definition is an open issue, of course. In some countries, they consider the zone as the country overall. So I think there is a space for improvement there. And I agree that we have to clearly identify the management of the crisis episodes in our system from a short-term perspective, and the management of a system in normal conditions and long-term issues and investment. Those three items are often mixed up in the discussion, and that's very bad, because we really need to discuss about long-term market review and not just about short-term prices. I stick to that for the moment.
Thanks a lot, Clara. So same question to you, Christoph. What should be prioritized short-term versus, what should be prioritized long-term, specifically, about wholesale market?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. First of all, good morning to everyone. From the Commission's perspective, of course, the impact which the gas price has had on power prices over the past month is generally a political concern. I think that's a fact. And there are many aspects that play into that. Remuneration of inframarginal generators is probably the most important one. And from the perspective of a prime minister or an energy minister, the question is fairly obvious, right? We have a gas price that's determined by the current geopolitical crisis. I have a renewable fleet or a nuclear fleet in my member state, which has the same production cost as it had before. Is it justified that in the current situation, all of a sudden I pay for that electricity a price which is significantly higher than what I was paying before? That's the overall question, and I think leaving aside, the technicalities, I think it's an issue that is difficult to ignore in the current crisis situation, and it's an issue that may arise also in future crisis situations. Now, when we look at possible tools that can address that situation, I think there is a range of different measures that we need to take into consideration, and it's not an issue, and I would fully agree with Clara, it's not an issue that is limited to the functioning of the day-ahead market or the intraday market or the short-term markets. It's a much broader issue, and it's certainly an issue which has also a lot to do with how these inframarginal capacities are being procured, how they are being procured by member states to the extent that public money is being used for their procurement, and how the relevant investments come about without public support in the instances where that is possible. So there we have a number of tools available. And I note also in the report, when you talk about a hybrid market setup where you have essentially a combination of the short-term market with different types of instruments that are aimed at providing not just a longer-term revenue stream for certain technologies, but at the same time also a revenue stream that is significantly less dependent on the ups and downs, be they general ups and downs or be they geopolitical ups and downs of the short-term market. So just to say that when we talk about that issue of decoupling, it is a much broader issue than just the question of, is it pay as bid or pay as clear? And I think it's important to keep all these aspects in mind.
Thank you, Christoph. So you just touched upon long-term contracting. So there's been quite a lot of noise lately around this issue. I think a lot of voices in academia and in the industry have been, calling for more long-term contracts. Depending on the region, also we've seen that in some regions of Europe, PPAs are quite developed, in others less so. So one question is, yes, of course, what can they bring? So we know they can bring, a certain level of stability and predictability that can benefit both energy developers and consumers. But where does the industry see blocks, and what does he expect to sort of support the uptake of such schemes? And I'm going to direct these questions first at Alain from EDF, if that's fine with you.
Yes, thank you very much, Alberic. And first, I would like to thank Sarah, to have started this study on market design quite before, the crisis we had in this year. So we have the opportunity to have an in-depth report from academics, which is treating a large range of subjects very deeply. And it's really welcome, in the debate we have now in Europe. Coming back, to long term, in my company, we really think there is a need of layer of long-term contract. So I will not come back again short-term. Everybody agrees short-term, we have to use it. It's the best way we have found to daily operate the generation mix we have in Europe, the best use of interconnection. So please don't touch that and nothing more of that. That's we always think. I hope it will be a global agreement of everybody on that. Coming back to shorter, to me back to long term. Yes, we have a problem. We have sold to citizens an energy transition in which we have low-cost renewables and low-cost nuclear, and they are facing high prices. So this is a problem. So that's why we have to find a solution in which it's now possible to transmit from generators to end consumers this low cost. And we think, that development of more long-term contracts, or call them PPAs, call them CFDs, I don't care. Let's say call them long-term contracts between all type of market actor, with or without the state. The question, it must be open, with or without. But first of all, on a market base, it is something that should be largely encouraged by a renewed, market design framework. And that's really something we call for. And we think that if in the coming reform, we should really be able to find solution in which customers, European customers, domestic industrial ones, have access to this low-cost generation we have been building for years today.
Thank you, Alain. And I'm going to ask the same question, to Inga Christine from Norsk Hydro, but maybe more from an industrial consumer perspective. What's where do you see blocks for this time of long-term contracting, and what's a desirable outcome?
Thank you, Albrecht, and thank you, Sir, for organizing this project and this arrangement, and thank you for the academics for this report. It's very good and it's very timely. And first to say, I very much agree on what's already said by all of you on the short-term markets. I know that there are many consumers, also industrial consumers, that are working on alternatives for the PS Clear. I'll just say that we in Hydro, we support the market mechanisms or the price setting mechanisms we have today, and we don't see any alternatives that will really work. So that said, and then to the long-term markets or the PPAs, and as you said, Albrecht, there's regional differences on the possibilities for long-term contracts, and we are located in the Nordics, where it has been very good opportunities for entering long-term contracts, and my company has many long-term contracts. We have entered long-term contracts both with existing generators and new generators, and of course the build out of renewables. We had a period where there was built new wind power in the Nordics, and that gave us good opportunities to enter into new long-term contracts, which we did. So from our perspective, the main barrier right now is the lack of project. Actually, the build out of new projects is not high enough, actually, and we know that if we could speed up the build out of new renewable projects, which we need due to an expected high increase in consumption, then I think the possibilities for commercial long-term contracts would improve, actually. So what could the government or the authorities do to more facilitate long-term contracts? That's very interesting discussions. Yes, and I think coming back to the question about decoupling, I think we all agree here that the decoupling in the short-term market is not what we really need, but of course many consumers now see that they maybe need to decouple from the volatility of the short-term prices through better hedging opportunities. And for many consumer groups, maybe smaller consumer groups, there could be done something to facilitate better hedging opportunities, I'm sure. And the liquidity in the forward markets is very low, and that's something we need to work on to improve. But maybe not go into detail there, but the forward market or the standardized market is not the option for all consumer groups. And for us, when entering into 20 years contracts, we can't do that in standardized forward markets on exchanges. It needs to be bilateral contracts, or at least it has been. And I can see that will change because consumers have so different needs and preferences. So then it's also difficult to standardize. But I think the like governmental guarantees and things like that could help for some consumers, and which are implemented in some countries. What I heard from my colleagues in Europe, elsewhere than the Nordics, one barrier is, of course, the different volume profiles of renewable generators and the baseload consumption they have. They are kind of looking for some help, or because to pay someone to take the risk of balancing this or firming from a volatile production to a baseload consumption, that's very expensive. But we don't have the answer on how to facilitate that yet, but that's something many are working on, and which I've heard is a barrier for many consumers to enter into long-term PPAs. Yeah, and yeah.
Yeah, sorry.
I have one more thing.
Sure.
Also, there's been a lot of discussions around tax systems lately, which also influence the incentives for generators to enter into long-term contracts. We need to be careful when designing tax system on generators.
Yeah, thank you. And I think that's a point that's also mentioned in the report. Going to another region, to Greece. So, Elena, maybe you can give us your perspective on what's the state of the market in Greece, and do you see the need for more PPAs, more government-backed PPAs? Is it something that's a priority for you guys?
Thank you. Thank you, Albrecht. And I will reiterate what everyone else said before. Thank you for this report. Very, very interesting analysis. It couldn't be better coordinate, but also better timed in terms of the discussion. I would agree that we need to look closer in terms of what's the problem, and what we need is really the problem. The market or the tools that we have today can help us deliver and achieve what we need to achieve to get to net zero in a safe and cheap way. So what we also understand as a utility in Greece, with a significant number of consumers across industrial, commercial, and residential, is that there is an appetite for long-term contracts. It took us across Europe years to de-risk the technologies. And now we have, it's a big win, right? We need at some point to look back and say, that's great. We made solar, wind, increasingly batteries, we made them cheap, we made them cost competitive. And now we need to leverage this and deliver cheap electricity to our consumers, going back to Christoph's point about consumers and how, and what's the signals that they see and what's the price that they pay at the end of the day. So we de-risk the technologies, and it's very, very important to make sure that we don't now add a new risk, which is a market risk, on all of us. And hence we can continue delivering. There are a number of regulatory barriers across European countries and in Greece. But at the same time, there is an appetite, as I said, from industrial, from commercial, a bit less from residential consumers on long-term contracts, because, they are green, they are cheap, and they shield them from the variations that we experience today. So removing the barriers and making sure that there are the frameworks in place to allow us build more cheap renewable energy, and then leverage this cheap renewable energy, and for the industry to be competitive, because there is an extra element there. it's very important. At the same time, this cannot happen without demand side management, and that's the next very, very important component of the system moving forward. And this is even more important for the residential clients, the residential consumers, where longer term PPAs, 10, 15 years, it's a big challenge. So yeah, I would say that overall, and back to Christine's point, we have seen that working in countries like the Nordics, right? We have seen PPAs working very, very well. So yeah, overall, I think there is definitely an appetite. We need to see how we can capture these long-term contracts, call them PPA, call them CFDs, call them what you want at this point, in order to deliver this green and resilient and cheap system that we want to deliver. I think that all the energy stakeholders agree on these three fundamentals. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Going to Italy, Fabio. So we've talked about PPAs, but do you see any other obstacles for the long-term decarbonization of the energy system, of electricity? Beyond PPAs, are there any other issues that you identify over the long term that could be addressed by market design evolutions?
Okay, good morning, first of all, and thank you for inviting me. I apologize for not being there and joining the meeting on via Zoom, and thank you also for the very effective summary from the first panel. So regarding your question, what I want to tell you today are yes, mainly 2 points. The first one is that the real issue in order to achieve the decarbonization target, I apologize, I know to be a bit off topic, but it's not market design, it's the permitting process. We do have an issue about it. Then, of course, we have an issue also regarding market design, because decarbonization in the electricity sector means, of course, renewable and storage, and spot market has been proved not to be fit for prompting investments, neither in renewables nor in storage. And we need to foster a market design that implies long-term contracts, in my opinion, with a central counterparty for renewable auctions, but also for storage, especially if we want to avoid to spend the next 10 years talking about PPA without signing them. Coming back to the first point and to your question, why the main important issue is the permitting process right now and not the market design? Well, I say over the past 18 months, even 20, international markets have seen sharp increases in gas, coal, CO2 prices, and then in electricity prices. Spot market prices and even future ones have been 5, 6, even 10 times higher than before the crisis somewhere. At the same time, we haven't seen a boost in renewable capacity, which is the answer to this energy crisis, both in terms of prices and in terms of security of supply. What I mean is that such a high electricity price would have ensured a very short payback period for investment in wind and in PV utility scale power plants. Nevertheless, we don't have seen a substantial increase in the amount of renewable capacity installed, entered into operation, or even authorized. So from my point of view, this clearly shows that the main problem holding back the development of renewable is not related to the price signals or to the profitability of these power plants, and consequently, it does not depend on how we decide to modify the market design, but the main problem is the permitting process, and it's a simplification, the real Deus ex machina to achieve energy transition. Just let me add a couple of consideration. In Italy right now, we have 110 gigawatt of PV power plants connection requests to high voltage networks. So 110 gigawatt. In 2022, the amount of PV entered into operation connected to high voltage network is 286 megawatt, while 1,200, so 4 times, entered into operation connected to low voltage network. This is clearly a paradox, because if we consider that the cost of installation and the different hours of irradiation, rooftop PV power plants cost up to 5 times more than utility scale power plants. So again, this clearly shows that the problem that we have, at least in Italy, is permitting. Second consideration, we have to remember also that energy transition is not just renewables, but it's also electrification of final consumption. Electrification is our chance to decarbonize the economy, to achieve a more livable cities, to increase our energy independence and to reduce energy prices. Electricity vector has finally become quite central in the European decarbonization policy. I believe we should be even braver on these policies, in particular for the residential sector and for the transport one. And then a very last consideration. I heard talking about smart meters before. I have a question about it. Why do we have to call them smart meters if we cannot use during energy crisis to avoid brownout, for example, because we cannot do it actually, and it's quite a pity. I will stop. Here.
I think you're making quite a good point. The fact that the so-called smart meters that we have been used in a relatively dumb way so far, at least in a very limited way, and I think that's also a point that we've heard numerous times before. Going over to Bill to a different issue, maybe because from a Northern Irish perspective, not being at the core of the EU decision making, but still being part of the market. What do you see as short-term priorities for further integration of the electricity market, for further deepening of the electricity market within the EU, but also with neighboring countries?
Thank you. And first, I'd just like to congratulate the authors on a comprehensive and timely report that deserves to be given a lot of attention for all those involved in the energy sector, and I'm sure it will be. I'm pleased that, in fact, and I endorse the point that this current position is not a market failure, and the risk is that short-term interventions will damage the long-term viability of the market and essentially impose extra costs on the system, because that is the way legislators and governments tend to work. But we do recognise the imperative for governments to deal with excess profits using their own tools, but do so in a way that limits the damage to incentives for generators, and to provide support for customers, particularly vulnerable ones, during this period of super high prices. From the point of view of Northern Ireland, and which is part and parcel of a single electricity market on the island of Ireland that is part of the European internal market, but is actually separated from it, then one of the biggest things would be to pick up one of the messages in the report to properly link the United Kingdom with Europe, such that in fact our market is properly coupled there in the day-ahead market and auctions, because at the moment it isn't. Though we do use Euphemia, but it's all the interconnectors at the moment are set to 0 on the first call, and most of the deals are done with no real intervention on the interconnectors. So that would be a major improvement, and cut the costs and make a more sophisticated and optimum energy balance for the system operators. Looking ahead, in Ireland, we have a market that's capable of running at 75% non-synchronous penetration, mainly due to wind. But it's clear that the system services that are needed by the system operator to be able to run that and to move towards up to 95% non-synchronous penetration, there's a hugely complex and growing in value, and it is immensely complicated for them to do that. And and quite complicated for the regulators to understand the balance of services being desired. The capital remuneration market is vital to provide the level of generation to support times when the renewable generation is not available, but finding the way that can keep that on stream and available is critical. We found that, and it's several of the other speakers have pointed out, that the actual theory is quite clear on these things, but planning matters, consenting matters, connection matters, and the ability to get new generation in the right place. That is quite a difficult problem, and that confuses all matters on whether or not you are aware you can and how effective you can run these auctions for long-term capacity. So I don't know. I think I'm looking forward to reading and sharing with colleagues the details of this report, and looking forward to the debate going forward on the issues around it. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Bill. Another issue that we've briefly touched upon before, and that's also been, less in the spotlight than the role of PPAs, but the future use and harmonization of CRMs, capacity remuneration mechanisms. And so I don't know how much how much of a focus it is for policymakers and regulators, but is it what do you see the need for change on this? Do you see a need for evolution, Clara, from an ACER perspective?
Okay, ACER has not a position yet, so I'm just talking on giving you my personal view. Something that was mentioned, I don't remember by whom, among the presenters, the speakers before, is that, or maybe it's in the report, that when we talk about long-term tools, we are discussing mostly about financial hedging. Actually, I think we need to discuss physical long-term mechanism, because we already have them. We have capacity remuneration mechanism, we have RES options, and those are markets. We have markets already in place with physical delivery. And we have the need that was mentioned by Fabio Bulgarelli, I think, to develop some tools, long-term tools for flexibility and storage. And I think that was mentioned as well when talking about PPAs. How can we balance the profile in our renewables production? So for sure, I think we need to bring all those tools into a harmonized framework. Now we have bits and pieces, so I do not fully agree with what you said, that these long-term tools are a complementary mechanism. I think they should become part of our market design, because for the time being, we do not have a clear EU framework, and we consider those mechanisms as state aid. Why so? I don't really understand. If we were able to define a standardized, harmonized framework, we could consider those markets as part of our market design under different time frames. So I think this is what we need to do. We need to identify long-term tools for adequacy, to develop renewables, to support flexibility, and to discuss, since they are related one to the other, they reach similar objectives. They hedge consumers as well, and they hedge producers, they help and support investments, but they have to be coordinated one with the other. So I think there is really a need to address all those items and maybe adapt under a EU framework the tools that we already have.
Thanks a lot, Clara, making the point, of harmonization at the EU level of these complementary tools. Christophe, is this something that, I'm sure the Commission has thought about that. Is there something you can tell us about, CRMs, the future role of CRMs and potential for harmonization, but not just CRMs, other market design complementary tools that, would be useful for the future?
Well, I cannot tell you today what the Commission is going to put forward in its proposal, and I hope I don't disappoint too many expectations if I say that I cannot do that. I think the wait for the public consultation is going to be not too long from now, so I don't think your patience will be put to the test much longer. But what I can say is to refer you back to the paper which the Commission issued in May this year, where there was already a bit of kind of a collection of different areas that the Commission would look at in relation to market design. And there indeed you find also the reference to the sort of long-term tools that we have been discussing here this morning, be they CFDs, be they PPAs. So I think there you already have an indication that this is certainly within the range of the things that we are looking at. As regards further detail, unfortunately, I can't pass them to you today.
Anything you can tell us maybe about more shorter term priorities for the wholesale market? Not talking about things that are be implemented over in the next 10 or 20 years, but maybe priorities for 2023.
So I mean, what I can say is the Commission will make a proposal for in March, and that proposal is going to be different in nature from the sort of short-term interventions that we have seen up to now, which were both in electricity and gas based on Article 122 of the treaty, and were therefore by definition time-limited interventions, which are aimed specifically at the current crisis situation and will all have an end date. Whereas the proposal that we will make in March is going to be a long-term proposal, in the sense that these will be lasting changes of the underlying ground rules governing the functioning of the electricity market. So they will not have any end date to them. That is, of course, not to say that these changes will be disconnected from the current crisis reality that we are living through, and that the experiences that we have all made in relation to market functioning in the current situation are not very much a driver of these changes. We also hope that these changes will be such that they will allow the co-legislators to proceed with them quite quickly, so that in particular, if we can expect that this crisis is probably not about to end within the next 2 months, that they may still have an impact on how the crisis continues to unfold from here. So that's very much an intention, but they will not be interventions which are time-limited crisis interventions.
Thanks, Christoph. And I think we'll get to some short-term priorities, some more short-term priorities in the retail discussion in a bit. But before we move to that, I'm going to go to Enel. So I don't know if Simone, if you managed to, I think you were having some connection issues. I don't know if you were not online, or if you want. We've got Andrea with us in the room, who can maybe stand in for you. Are you ready to speak? Or
no, I'm sorry, I've a logistic problem. Sorry, because I'm arriving. But if you, I could be on a decent situation in 3 minutes from now, if it's possible.
Sorry, I didn't catch that. Yeah, okay. I'll come back to you in a bit then. There's a couple of questions that I think we can take relating to wholesale from the audience. one I think that I can direct to maybe Michael or Bert from the academic team on that's from Ola Rude who's asking, if we assume the short-term market remains on the same principles, could we then not also assume the auctions for long-term contracts with, for instance, LCC type buyer can be A, the central tenet of the design for coordinating competitive long-term supply and demand, and B, that such long-term auctions contain delivery and offtake of energy, capacity, and carbon abatement elements? Quite a detailed question. I don't know who wants to take it from the academic team, if Bert or Michael. Michael, you want to have a stab at that one? Yeah.
Yeah, let me have a go, because I've been burning to say some of these things. Okay, you noticed we had a picture of the California electricity crisis. When prices go up in short-run markets, everybody regrets that they hadn't signed a long-term contract beforehand at a lower price. Okay, that doesn't mean it's a good idea to sign long-term contracts at high prices, and we discussed that very clearly in the report. And we discussed that long-term contracts are a bet on the future. You're betting that you're going to think, over the course of the long-term contract, that this was a good deal. But of course, that's not guaranteed. And I think one of the things that we discuss in the report is, some countries will have different preferences as to the extent to which they want to enter into long-term contracts, given that there is the capacity for regret. Okay, so the UK is an interesting example, because I think so often these long-term contract positions are just a matter of degree. So we're signing long-term contracts for offshore wind, for new nuclear, and the share of electricity produced that's going to be covered by a long-term contract is going to gradually increase over time. But one of the questions is, well, what will be the maximum share that it will ever reach in terms of government-backed PPAs? At the rate we're going, it's going to increase, relatively slowly. And, I don't know, maybe 30% of generation will be covered by them by 2030, maybe. But I think then the question for each country is, well, what share do you want covered by them? And it's very unlikely that you're going to get to 100%, which is what some people, I think, have in mind. So clearly they are an option. They do look really sensible when prices spike after you've signed the long-term contract, but they're not a one-way bet. Right.
I'm not sure I understood the question. I think that the UK example, it seems to be working, so I think that's good. I wrote some things down when Clara was saying about physical and financial contracts, and I think it's not always, just a bit deviating from your question, but so I think it's not always clear what we really mean with physical and financial contracts. So one way of saying it is about the delivery, physical versus financial delivery. But if you really look to the electricity market, if you do not deliver, you end up paying the balancing market. So in the end, everything is financial. So I think a physical contract is more like a financial contract where your hedge is backed up by a physical asset. Instead of having a financial hedge, you have like assets. You have physical assets that are going to back up your commitment. And then there are typically some tests on availability and technology, and we don't really understand empirically what this all means. So I think we need, as academics, to do some more research trying to understand what is the price that we pay for those capacities and what are we actually paying for. So it might be a risk premium, but there might also be a cost of this physical hedge that might be related to entry barriers. And that might then help us to see whether there's actually state aid or whether there is no state aid. So if everything is working well and this is the risk is priced correctly, then this might not really be state aid. And then there was also a question or discussion about long-term contracts for storage. And I think there is not too much that we know about that. So it's not so easy to design good contracts for long-term contracts for storage. It's also not clear how much demand we need, because we need some complex portfolio optimization. We have risk. And if you want to decide how much you're going to buy, it depends on your portfolio. So you could design, as a theory person, you could design like a very nice auction with different products, different types of technologies. And then you could design something that's nice for a theory person, but I don't know how practical this is going to be. And then you also need to design contracts that give the incentives for those storage operators to be available when they're necessary, and also to de-risk their risk. So it's a very complex and exciting question as a theory person, but I don't know how practical that is. So one of the proposals that we do is that maybe we want to have contracts where firms can submit portfolios, that they submit some wind farm plus some storage, and that they bid this together into the market. And maybe then the complexity is put and the innovation is put to the private parties and not so much to the auctioneer. So that might be a potential way forward. Yeah, I think that's some of the ideas that I had for the moment.
Thanks. Thank you, Bert. Simone, I see that you're now ready and set, so I think you've got quite a lot of things to react on coming in.
Yes. Thank you very much. I apologize to you for not being here with you, and also for this logistical problem, but there is a very bad weather and the flight was delayed. So thank you very much for your passion. So no, but there's allowed me to react to some of the things that have been already discussed, and a few points. First one, it's very true that you have to keep separated the short-term emergency management and the long-term reform. This is very important. Even if for us it's a bit of frustration, because we have been probably among the first pushing since quite a long time ago the idea of the need to complement the present market with some different instrument that for us was needed in order to stabilize the price. But today we discover that this instrument, which is basically long-term contractualization, may be also called as defined as a decoupling tool, but this was a more recent discovery. Second observation, I'm not so excited by the idea of discussing if the market works or does not work. It seems a quite theoretical discussion, because if you say that market works very well, but we need taxation in order to claw back extra profits, I have some doubt that this is a definition of market properly working. And this connects to what Fabio was saying. Fabio is largely right and saying, well, the big problem is permitting, but there is a but in what you said. That it's true that an investment in a renewable carried out today could theoretically bring a lot of value to the investor, if you don't consider the multi-layer stratification of clawback mechanism, ex post taxation, revenue taxes, etc., which have been implemented more or less in many countries in Europe. Third, it's again, maybe that the market is working or not working. What's sure is that the present market model was not sufficient to achieve the basic objective of security of supply and sustainability, which was in some way a part of the comprehensive European strategy. That's the reason why many countries in Europe had to implement a complementary capacity market, while more or less all European countries had to implement some tender or some incentive for renewable. Otherwise, there were no way to achieve the renewable target. Other countries have strategic reserve models in place. So basically, we carried out an analysis a few months ago demonstrating that the large majority of investment in power generation in Europe after the beginning of liberalization have been implemented thanks to some specific extra market mechanism. So this is, overall, it is not what I define as successful market. But anyway, again, I don't want to focus on definition. The reality is that we don't need to modify the market, which is a fantastic short-term market, very efficient in order to dispatch and regulate the production of plants, basically flexible plants with variable costs. But this market has not to be modified, has to be complemented with different tools. It's perfectly true what somebody said, that there are no barriers theoretically for the subscription or long-term contracts, but this is not happening. This is not happening but everybody has some kind of anecdotics about, there is a contract here, a contract there, but basically the impact of long-term contractualization in the European market is very modest. And then even if you don't like top-down dirigism, it's clear that that's time to do some kind of top-down dirigism, which today has a fantastic opportunity to catch two apples with in the same time. One is the famous decoupling. The second one is giving long-term signal for investment and and O&M of fixed cost plants, which I put in the same box, renewables and the nuclear in this case. It seems to me that the Commission is starting to look at it with very carefully, and we are very happy with that. I have no idea what is the best way to promote this. Centralized platform, some kind of procurement objectives for final customer or retailer. There are different mechanisms. What we have in mind, I think all of us, is that you need an initial kickstart in order to create a liquidity, a reference model, a reference price that enable step by step private suppliers, private customers, and producers to start to give the needed relevance to this market that today is very marginal. We believe that we are in the right direction. There is a common perception. My suggestion for everybody is to get rid of this dialectic between the market and the extra market. It's just the need to complement a market which was built under specific condition in order to reflect the objective of 20 years ago, which are probably different than today, with another market, which has to be a market that has to be competitive, but that needs some kind of push in order to become so liquid. I think that some of the elements that the academics working on the project presented today and in the report, and also some of the reflection, I would say the loud reflection that the Commission appears to present during this debate are going in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Simone. And I'm actually going to use you to transition to the second part, which will be more focused on wholesale. Just so you made, sorry, on retail. Sorry. Yeah. So do you think, so Simone, do you see how does this translate at retail level? How do you see better ways to connect wholesale and retail? What needs to change at national level to better align on say wholesale markets and European-wide objectives? Do you see the need for change at retail also?
Yes, why not? Yes, why not? In the sense that I give you an example. When we started with the promotion of renewable investments, for example, the mechanism, the model of green certificates, which had many flaws at that time. I don't want to represent the model of green certificate, which worked pretty bad in many markets. But in some way, the idea was, okay, we have a target which is a societal target. And in order to achieve this target, we try to create a market which push the active participation of the buyers in order to give liquidity to a market which should bring the investments in it. Probably today the mechanism should be completely different. But if instead of having the centralized tenders, we could have a progressive participation of retailers or final customers to some of the objective that energy sectors have today, which basically are price stability in the long term, renewable developments, and security of supply. This could be very useful, especially today. Today, you have a great opportunity because, as was said by one of the first speakers, I'm sorry, I was going out of the place. I'm not sure who was speaking, but as I say, today is not very good. It's not a very good moment to subscribe as a buyer a long-term contract? I would say it depends. It depends what is the price. If you are subscribing a long-term contract of a customer at a price which is close to the system marginal price, well, that's not a good moment. But if you buy a 10-year, 15-year contract, also on an existing fleet, let's say at LCOE, at a reasonable LCOE, well, that's very good. That'd be very convenient. Today, that would be very difficult. Why? Because there are not the technical means, because the guarantees costs are very high, because you don't have a reference price. We know all the barriers. If we could push with some, some constriction, also this kind of evolution, well, why not?
Thanks, Simone. Bill, and then Clara, maybe from a regulator, from a national regulator perspective, during the crisis, have you identified specific issues? I mean, obviously, I'm sure you did, but what do you think are some of the the short and longer term solutions for retail markets to ride out of the crisis and align them on wholesale? Starting with Bill.
It has been quite a difficult time for retail suppliers, and the lack of being able to hedge is a particular problem in the particular long-term hedging, but that's been talked about quite a lot. There has been quite a lot of support within Britain for suppliers that have failed, and quite a high cost coming through the system to provide that. So I think there's and the report does talk about the need for greater resilience in retail suppliers in their finances to be able to resist the kind of shocks in prices. So I'm not certain that I've got very much more to add than that. It's quite difficult to see how to deal with it more than what is going on in most markets. Your questions go on to ask about how you deal with the customer end, and I suppose that you're going to go on to vulnerable customers as well, but that's a different question.
Thank you, Clara. From I mean, I guess you could go more of a bird eye view from Acer's perspective.
Yeah, again, we are building on national experiences, but it's very difficult, and there is no silver bullet. So let me comment on something that has been said before, that our markets have proved to be resilient. That's true, but we have to recognize that at the retail level, we had a lot of intervention to support retailers, sort of too big to fail kind of situation. And we have to look into that. It's not being blind, and ask ourselves what are our weaknesses today vis-a-vis an external shock. And I think counterpart risk and financial cost have proved to be very relevant. And that's a bridge to the long-term market design, because long-term markets can help reducing price volatility for a given share of energy. So it is important still, as I think Simone was saying, it is important to work on long-term price signals. At retail level, I think, we have the risk of going back to vertical integration as the easiest way to hedge risk, or if not a proper vertical integration, only companies that have big collaterals being able to survive under a crisis. And the question is, what can we do? How can we address this issue that is directly linked to liberalization of retail markets? I don't want to give an answer, it would be my own answer, but for sure is a question that is not always addressed. And I think we need to address it, and we need to think carefully about how to regulate supplier of last resort and the default suppliers, because this is something that has not been harmonized yet at European level. And now it's time to learn from best practices and to look into the issue. One last point is we need to work on our information system to make sure that we properly identify vulnerable consumers. And that means being able to know the welfare or the socioeconomic position of our customers, at least some of them, because when a shock comes, we don't have the money to support everybody. And that was maybe is not even necessary and is not even right, because by giving support, we reduce the price signal somehow, not at the margin. If we are doing it well, we should not touch the margin, but still we reduce the overall bill. And that has an impact as well on demand. So I think this is something that is not easy to implement, but we have to work on being able to implement more focused policies when it comes to supporting our residential customers.
Thank you, Clara. Going back to a corporate perspective, I'm going to France actually, because I think, I mean, it is an interesting case study that's also in this report, and a bunch of actions have been taken in the French retail market. From an EDF perspective, what changes do you see the need for at a retail level?
First, one point which is important to keep in mind, in the different documents that the Commission has published in the past months, there was a push towards regulated tariff for domestic customers. And we are very happy to say that this tool has been recognized as a possibility to protect customers. It was something that EDF and the French state had pushed for during the clean energy package. And we are very happy to see this regulated tariff to be recognized as an efficient tool to protect customers against striking prices as we have had this year. And it has been a very efficient tool in France to prevent domestic customers from having very high invoices, while at the same time, as RT, our French TSO, is publishing these days, we have a real decrease of demand from domestic customers, even if domestic customers are not exposed to very high prices. So there's a real demand response in France through campaigns by the state and the different suppliers. This is efficient. Having said that, the crisis we had in 2021 has shown plenty of bankruptcies of suppliers. This is a problem. And it has shown that we need, to have more financial secured suppliers in the market to be sure that they are able to cope with volatility of prices, increase of prices, not to be in a situation where customers are being left alone. I think the worst situation has been in Czech Republic with the Bohemia bankruptcy. We have had some in France, but it is very expensive then for a supplier like us, to get back customers in our portfolio, very expensive. So, and complicated, and it induces stresses on the customers. One point also, on flexibility. We need flexibility in the long term. There is no debate on that. Absolutely no debate. But we must find, the right solutions. And perhaps, one word, the dynamic supply, which has been imposed by the past directive to both big suppliers. We don't think this is a solution for developing flexibility. We have had in France for 40 years critical peak pricing in place and time of use tariff. And these offers have shown their efficiency for 40 years in terms of demand response for domestic customers. Every day at 10 o'clock in the evening, we have a demand response of 3 gigawatt up on our load curve. You can see it on the RT French website. These 3 gigawatt up are the beginning of use of water boilers, which start in the evening when the demand is lower than during the day. So massive demand response for domestic customer is possible and does not require dynamic pricing. We need, to find adequate solutions which are based, on adequate supply offer which are made to domestic customers. And this winter, we have been, in EDF advertising a lot our critical peak pricing offers, and we have plenty of new subscribers for that, and it works. Perhaps one question maybe on long-term contracts regarding, I should finish at this point, long-term contracts for customers. This is a question. Of course, everybody, think it's interesting to have more certainty for investors in nuclear, in wind, in solar, in storage. So that's, I think, the idea of long-term contract here is no more debated. Oh, I hope it will be no more debated. The next question is that you need a counterpart for these investors in generators. So we speak of suppliers, we speak of customers, but if we speak of customers, we have to see which type of customers can really be a counterpart of a long-term contract. Of course, a very big industrial company can be, but the domestic customer is more complicated. So the question would be, and I don't have the answer, is how can we, organize long-term contracts in the future, given the fact that we have to keep this retail competition for small customers, on which you will never impose a 10 or 20-year contracts to domestic customers. It's not a question of reintegrating. It's a question to develop competition, to keep competition on retail markets, having secured long-term investments.
Thank you, Alain. And I'll maybe ask Elena to add to that, because I think it'd be interesting to get the Greek perspective, as there's been quite a few measures have been introduced in Greece over recent months. So I'd be interested to hear how you see this issue as well.
Thank you. Overall, I don't think that I will agree with the messaging that everyone else gave earlier on. I mean, in Greece, we had a national subsidy program for all the consumers, industrial, commercial, residential, everyone, up to a certain point of consumption, to make sure that we won't encourage overconsumption, which was a tricky one when the consumers don't see the right price signal. And as PPC, we also subsidized our consumers directly with like 300 million euros. And we took a big hit on this. But what is important, as everyone said earlier on, is to create the right frameworks and also the right tariffs, and to allow customers to leverage the cost competitive electricity that we can have in our system moving forward. And again, as said, and going back, the discussion is going back to long-term contracts, right? For industrial and commercial users, assuming that, as Simon said, the renewable energy development can match the demand at the retail level. We have some tools in place with the long-term contracts that can make sure that costs and bills are going down. Again, I'm coming back to my previous point, where demand response, demand side management is important, especially for residential consumers. And we need to make sure that smart meters operate as they can, as they do, and especially if you consider the electrification of other sectors. We are talking about passenger cars, we are talking about heat pumps. These new uses, they add to the system, but at the same time, they can, if the right frameworks are in place, they can give us something very powerful to work with, dynamic demand. And they can help consumers a lot, put pressure, actually downward pressure on prices, because you need demand to respond to your variable production, or the other way around. So it's really, I think, increasingly the whole grain of the power system, how you engage the consumers, but definitely putting tools in place and leveraging demand side management. We think that it's at the heart of this question. Thank you.
Thanks, Elena. Christophe, any thoughts on the observations just made by Elena and Alain on retail when it comes to long-term hedging or short-term demand reduction?
Yes, thank you very much. So first of all, to say that also consumer aspects are very much part of our reflections. They have been part of our reflections pretty much from the start of this process, and also there I can refer back to the May paper, which already had a reference to those aspects. I think as regards demand response, that's also a very important topic for us, and it is a very important topic for us in two respects, not just limited to the consumer aspects, but also related to the wholesale aspects, because we have, of course, also the part of the demand response where there's direct participation in the wholesale market, and how should that happen? How can that happen? How can that happen on the best possible terms, so that we build up sort of a role for flexible technologies in the future market that can over time reduce the role that fossil fuels play in that market. The final aspects which I've heard here this morning, and which is also very relevant from our perspective, is the question of suppliers and, you know, the necessary strength of suppliers to weather storms. And there, I mean, I can only say that also some of the examples that have been given here this morning of suppliers who went under in the current crisis, that is certainly an experience which also has an impact on our thinking in that respect. Now, that thinking is always something which it has two sides to it. On the one hand, it's important to have the necessary prudential requirements in place so that, you know, there are no systemic risks created by excessive risk taking. And I would say that's a relationship between the consumer contracts that you sign and how you procure your own electricity. So these two things have a relationship. But at the same time, it's of course also very important that any regulatory requirements on suppliers do not contribute to reducing consumer choice. So they have to be, you know, properly calibrated so that we do not end up in a situation where, you know, we generate the sort of concern that also Clara has voiced, that, you know, basically as a result of the crisis, we end up with a significantly thinned out landscape as regards consumer choice.
Thanks a lot. And you refer back to a number of trade-offs that were mentioned again in the recommendations that we talked about earlier. We've got 13 minutes left, so I'm going to try and make room for questions and answers. There's a bunch in the chat, but I think there's also a few in the room. And I'll also give the chance also to the academic team to make some comments on what's been said, and maybe to also ask some questions to panelists if there are any. But I think I had a question to my right to start with. So if you can state your name and affiliation before. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Vikram Balish, and I'm based with Frontier Economics, an economic consulting firm here in Brussels. I actually had a question on the wholesale section in relation to firmness, so I'm actually glad that you answered that question around portfolio bidding. I will have a look at that example in the report. It sounds pretty interesting. But on the retail side, I note that you recommended rising block tariffs, and I thought that was really intriguing. I guess I just wanted to understand how the authors saw that interacting with, I guess, more sort of time of use tariffs as well. So sort of the interaction between rising block tariffs and dynamic pricing. Thank you.
Thank you. And there was another question in the chat from Charles Esser from SEER also on the functioning of rising block tariffs. That was a bit different, but maybe I can tie it to this question, and maybe someone in the team, maybe Chloe or someone else can take it. So just to add, Charles' question was, how does a block retail market pricing take into account that very affluent consumers may pay very low prices because they're prosumers with rooftop solar and have a low consumption level from the network, such that much less affluent consumers without access to rooftop solar would pay more for their electricity? So it's a different question, but also related to this rising block tariff proposal. So maybe I'll give it to Chloe, and if anybody else from the academic team wants to add something, please feel free.
Yeah, thank you for the question. So tariff, how you set the right tariff to give the right signal. And I would say there's no clear answer, right? So obviously, but I want to stress some trade-off here. So, and it was clear from the panel discussion that we just have here is you need to have simple tariffs, simple enough so you have the right incentive and people understand. So that's why how much they're gonna pay if they go to the next level. So I think to some extent block tariff is interesting because it's maybe more simple than tariff time of use tariff. So that would be a something that we could compare. But I think there are studies showing that this could be really complex for a consumer to understand how much at the end of the day they're gonna pay for their consumption. So if they don't understand, or it is difficult to understand or to assess how much they pay, ex ante, it is then difficult for them to reduce their consumption. That could be one explanation. So simplified tariff will be one way. Then regarding the second question, can we have fair tariff? Well, we would like to. But again, there are multiple. So what is interesting, and also what we have been trying to show in our report, and that's, I think, one of the value of this report is we have really detailed case studies. And when we see that in different country, retailers have offered different type of tariff, right, and different type of contract. So to some extent, I will say that the consumers, depending on their consumption level and their need, they should find the right contract or the right tariff for them. So I think that's maybe the answer. The third point maybe I want to mention is that what was interesting in this energy crisis is that, of course, given the soaring price, we have seen that some contract were not offer anymore, typically a fixed price contract. It was not the case in France, but in some countries. So the number of contract available went down, which is then the market was much more liquid. So that's maybe in a nutshell how I will answer in terms of tariff.
Thank you. Michael, do you want to add anything to that? No, I know you've been advocating for these rising block tariffs for a few months now, even more so. All right. Okay, there's any more questions in the room now? Because I've got a bunch of questions I can read out. They're all quite long, right? So bear with me. I think I'm gonna go to Catherine because there was a question around resilience and how to, I'm gonna try and maybe I'm going to oversimplify, sorry, but about how how we can make our electricity grid more resilient, and how does this play into market design issues going forward, underlining the fact that transmission grids are very stressed and present risks to operators. So how do we get to a point where operational risk data is shared between TSOs and DSOs for coordination across grids and international borders? I think that's an issue that you're actually working on as part of a different SER project right now. So I wanted to share this one with you. And I think you also wanted to come in with some comments on the CRM. So maybe I'll give you the opportunity to do that at the same time. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Alberic, and thank you for the question online. Indeed, we are working right now on another project that deals with resilience and the role of grid operators in that connection, because we have seen a series of shortcomings during the past years in Europe, but as well abroad in terms of resilience of the electricity and gas grids. We do find references increasingly to resilience as a criteria for developing national measures, but as well European measures in the legislation, in European legislation, in addition to national legislation. Italy, France, the UK, they have also been working on such a framework for building or fostering resilience. And we do find, as I mentioned, some references to that. And that's primarily in European legislation, and that's primarily at the level of the planning for the operators, infrastructures, TSO, DSO, that the risk of resilience is translated, but we see a lot of shortcomings. It's primarily seen as a cost that should be factored in the cost benefit analysis. So still we're missing a really complete understanding and methodology around working on resilience and fostering it. So that's something that we will comment further on in the upcoming months. And I would like to comment as well on capacity remuneration mechanisms. And actually I would like to quote Commissioner Margrethe Vestager. It was in 2016. And she said that even if capacity mechanisms are well designed, they can't replace essential electricity market reforms. And if you remember at that time, that came after a series of many cases around capacity remuneration mechanisms, a series of approval under stated rules of national measures in France, Germany, Greece, Italy, Poland, and the UK. And that as well triggered a reform under the Clean Energy Package. And we now have a full section on capacity remuneration mechanisms under the title of what was titled under the third energy package, generation adequacy, that is now resource adequacy. And we do have harmonized criteria for designing those mechanisms. So we have already had a discussion on that. And I think that what Clara is pointing out rightly, and that's something that we started raising in our report as well, is another approach to capacity remuneration mechanism as part of permanent market design, something to address and something that could be part of market reform, because that will be quite an important change. Just a reminder, in the legislation as it is today, so that's in the electricity regulation, the requirement is that capacity remuneration mechanism should address a clear shortcoming that comes also out of the resource adequacy assessment. It should be temporary and a last resource solution. So are we seeing a change in the narrative here? I think that will be answered probably in March. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine. Going back to the question, so there's a number, so I'm going to try and take maybe a last one or a couple and direct them to Michael, or if anyone else from the panel also wants to answer them, please feel free. There's one from Richard Masquelier, who says, in its April 2022 report, Acer acknowledges the merits of temporary relief valve mechanisms as they set ex ante extraordinary circumstances where the price formation can be temporarily amended. Among the advantages, Acer states it gives regulatory stability and relief to consumers when triggering events are well defined in advance. What's your opinion on adding a similar measure to the short-term market design? I'm going to direct it to Michael. I think I know the answer already. And I don't know if Clara, you want to answer, to comment on that or not. I'll let you decide. Thank you.
Okay, let me try and say something new. Clearly, any interference in the short run market is very, very dangerous. And so I think we need to be very clear that and the report, I think we discussed this very nicely, that, you know, that sounds like a really bad idea because it reduces efficiency at a time when what the market is doing is delivering security of supply. Okay, and that's essentially, you know, that's much more valuable than some of the benefits of these interventions. I liked some of the things that Simone said that were relevant to this. He actually said, is taxation plus market design a failure? And I think we need to just bring back the situation that we're in is truly exceptional. You know, you look at the graph of prices of gas and wholesale prices of gas and electricity, it is literally off the chart in history. Certainly since the single market was formed, and looking back historically for heating fuel, we're at prices not seen for hundreds of years per unit of energy. And for electricity, we're looking at prices not seen since the 1930s. Okay, so we need to remember that, yeah, look, if you're in a war situation, yes, it's okay to combine taxation and market design elements, The other thing I wanted to say is whenever we talk about interventions that might happen in such a situation, we do need to remember that the government offers everybody a CFD. You know, that's the way to think about what government intervention, which it comes in the form of a subsidy plus subsequent taxation. Governments have across Europe offered certain types of customer an effective CFD. And I think we need to always, when we're thinking about putting in place more CFDs to handle this situation, whether they're going to be better than the CFD the government is currently offering us on existing generation. And the fact is, you know, this is a sector where there's always going to be political interest, and where you can't get away from the fact that if, you know, truly exceptional situations happen, you might end up in this situation where we all call in the government CFD.
Thanks, Michael.
Can I?
Clara? Yeah,
can I,
Clara,
yeah,
and then
yeah,
Simone.
very briefly. First of all, the April report was written in April, so by definition. So it was quite a different situation. And now we are looking to into a long-term market reform, and the long-term market reform should look at affordability, okay, but plus security of supply. I don't want to repeat everything I already said before. So I think we need a fully fledged analysis. Not that the valve is not an interesting mechanism. It still is an interesting mechanism, but we have to look into the European how that would work into our current situation in an enduring market reform. But having said that, when we look at short-term markets, it's true that we have let them work, okay, but you already mentioned a power market issue. And when, if I compare the European market design to the US market design, I see in the US market design much more attention to an ex-ante control of the exercise of market power in short-term markets. So I wouldn't say that out of the chart. Is something that needs to be taken into account. Of course, our market is a different market, and I'm not supporting a deep intervention in our short-term market, as I said before, but in our theoretical short-term market design is a place where everybody bids at this variable short-term variable cost. If the market doesn't close, then the price goes to the value of lost load. But usually even 1 hour before not closing the market, your clearing price is the short-term marginal cost. So maybe that's the reference, at least to me, that's the soft reference for energy on the market. And in my opinion, we have proved that that type of model in reality for different reasons doesn't work as expected. So just to summarize, I don't think that tool, I don't see that mechanism as implemented in the short and in the market reform for an enduring market reform. I don't see that. As I said before, we have to focus on long-term markets. Taxation is a good way to address shocks, short-term shocks, even though they have, of course, the money goes to the public budget. You are never certain that it comes back to energy consumers. This is a lesson learned from the emergency as well.
Thanks, Clara. Simone, you've got your hand up, so very briefly, because it's all four, so we
1
need to wrap
minute,
up.
just to comment Michael's comment on my comment. So you are perfectly right, Michael. I'm not saying that I don't mean that taxation is a bad measure. I strongly believe that, and this is what actually we propose to the Commission, and to utilize as an emergency measure taxation and clawing back the extra revenues as probably the most applicable way. Probably also considering a price which could be lower than what has been defined now, but equal for everybody, you know, because the problem again is the difference that you may inject in the system. But in any way, if we rely on the fact that we need some extra margin coming from the difference between my cost of production and the system adjusted price in order to justify the investment. When this extra margin is too much, this is unsustainable, it has to be taxed. We find ourselves in some kind of retroactive loop. So the reality for us is very clear that this is a fantastic tool, but this is not the tool aimed at giving to investor and to customer the benefits of a transition which brings a large part of the generation in Europe to our model, which is based on fixed costs.
Thank you, Simone. And very last question, I'm going to try my luck again with Christophe with a question you probably can't answer that's coming from the audience. She's the Commission proposal on electricity market reform.
I will make it sound nice. So.
Yeah, thank you. So you can use that to make some nice parting comments. Do you know if the March proposal will come under will be under the traditional co-legislation procedure or under the fast let's say the fast process that's been used recently?
Well, so the first reason I can't answer it is because I don't think it's the Commission that's going to decide that, because that's on the co-legislators having to decide how they will handle it. As I've already said a while ago, I think it is the intention that what we would put is such that member states and the Parliament can deal with it quickly. Because as I said, there are some lessons from the crisis that are to be taken, and there is an ambition that what we will put forward should have an impact quickly. So I think that would speak for relatively swift treatment also at the level of the co-legislators, but I'm certainly not in a position to tell them how they are to handle their legislative process. So I think we will need to see what prioritization they attach to the project once it leaves the doors of the Commission and lands on their desk.
Thank you very much. Very last words, Niels Henrik, or their co-academic director. Any parting words based on the discussion that we just had? In something, maybe a reaction in just one or two sentences, and then I'll wrap up.
I think I'll just say thank you. It's thank you to our sponsors for sponsoring an extremely interesting project and for discussing with us along the way, giving us input, which has been very important food for thought and has certainly shaped much of our discussion. And thanks to my colleagues, it's been really enjoyable, hard work and more work, I think, than we had expected beforehand, but very rewarding. And thank you everybody for coming and for sharing your views with us.
Yeah, and thank you for those who are following us online. You are close to 200 live at some point, so that's great. Yeah, so sorry for going over time. So you're off the hook now. And for those who are here with us in person, lunch is served just next door. So thanks again for joining us today, and see you soon. Ciao.